A major legal bombshell has just dropped from the Northern District of California, completely halting an attempt by the Department of Homeland Security to strip hundreds of thousands of people of their legal status. In a ruling with massive implications for immigration law and executive power, a federal judge has blocked DHS Secretary Kristi Noem's move to terminate temporary protected status for Venezuelan nationals. If there was ever an assumption that the executive branch has unlimited discretion over immigration policy, this ruling delivers a sharp correction. In a scathing opinion, U.S. District Judge Edward M. Chen did not simply block the termination on a technical procedural issue. He ruled that Secretary Noem lacked the statutory authority to take this action in the manner she attempted. More significantly, the court found that the decision was driven by what it described as sweeping negative generalizations and negative stereotypes about Venezuelan migrants. For approximately 350,000 Venezuelans currently living in the United States, this ruling represents the difference between lawful employment and the immediate risk of deportation. But beyond the humanitarian stakes, the decision sets a powerful constitutional precedent defining how much authority a DHS secretary actually has and where that authority ends. To understand the gravity of the ruling, it is important to understand what Temporary Protected Status, or TPS, is and why it exists. TPS is a humanitarian designation granted by the Department of Homeland Security. It allows nationals of certain countries to remain in the United States and work legally when conditions in their home country, such as armed conflict, environmental disaster, or extraordinary political instability, make safe return impossible. Venezuela was designated for TPS due to severe political instability, economic collapse, and humanitarian crisis. Millions fled the country amid shortages of food, medicine, and basic services. For years, TPS holders from Venezuela have lived and worked legally in the United States under this protection. Earlier this year, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem moved to rescind that designation. The termination would have stripped TPS holders of work authorization and placed them at risk of deportation. That move has now been blocked by the federal court. Judge Chen ruled that the termination violated the Administrative Procedure Act, the federal law that governs how executive agencies make, change, and reverse policy. Under the Administrative Procedure Act, agencies are required to provide reasoned explanations for major policy changes. They must rely on facts, consider relevant evidence, and address the real-world consequences of their actions. When agencies fail to meet those requirements, courts can invalidate their actions as arbitrary and capricious. The court found that DHS failed on multiple fronts. First, Judge Chen ruled that Secretary Noem lacked statutory authority to rescind TPS in the way she attempted. While DHS does have authority over TPS designations, that authority is not unlimited. When TPS is granted because conditions in a country are unsafe, terminating that protection generally requires a factual showing that those conditions have materially improved. In this case, the court found that DHS failed to provide sufficient evidence that conditions in Venezuela had stabilized enough to justify ending TPS. Instead of a fact-based assessment of conditions on the ground, the court concluded that the termination reflected a policy preference rather than an evidence-driven determination. The ruling emphasized that DHS failed to meaningfully engage with contrary evidence, including widespread reporting on Venezuela's ongoing political repression, economic collapse, and humanitarian crisis. The court also faulted DHS for failing to consider what the law refers to as reliance interests. Reliance interests recognize that when the government grants lawful status, people structure their lives around it. In this case, roughly 350,000 individuals built lives in the United States based on TPS protections. They took jobs, signed leases, paid taxes, started families, and integrated into their communities. Judge Chen ruled that DHS could not simply disregard those reliance interests without providing a rigorous and reasoned explanation. The court found that DHS failed to do so. While the Administrative Procedure Act violations alone were enough to block the termination, the court went further into constitutional territory. The most striking aspect of the ruling involves the court's finding of unconstitutional racial and national origin animus. Under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, the government is prohibited from making decisions motivated by hostility toward a particular race or nationality. In legal terms, such hostility is referred to as animus. Judge Chen ruled that the termination of TPS for Venezuelans was tainted by such animus. The court examined public statements and rationales offered by Secretary Noem and concluded that they relied on sweeping negative generalizations and negative stereotypes about Venezuelan migrants. In unusually direct language, the opinion described these characterizations as stereotyping and racism. It is rare for a federal court to explicitly describe the actions of a cabinet secretary in such terms. Courts typically exercise extreme caution when addressing questions of discriminatory intent at the highest levels of government. That makes this finding particularly significant. The court concluded that the decision to terminate TPS was not based on a neutral application of immigration law. Instead, it reflected a desire to exclude or punish a specific group of people based on national origin. This finding creates a substantial obstacle for the government on appeal. Procedural violations can sometimes be corrected. A factual finding of discriminatory intent is far more difficult to overcome. The court also addressed whether allowing the termination to take effect while litigation continued would cause irreparable harm. Irreparable harm refers to injury that cannot be undone later, even if a court ultimately rules in favor of the affected parties. Judge Chen concluded that ending TPS would indeed cause irreparable harm. Termination would immediately revoke work authorization, exposing long-settled individuals to deportation and placing families at risk of separation. The court noted that if TPS were terminated now and later reinstated after years of litigation, the damage would already be done. People could lose jobs, homes, and legal status. Some could be deported to unsafe conditions. Families could be permanently separated. Those harms cannot be easily reversed. The court also emphasized the broader economic impact. TPS holders are lawfully integrated into the U.S. workforce and economy. Their removal would not only harm them, but would also disrupt employers, industries, and local communities that rely on their labor. Based on these findings, Judge Chen issued an injunction blocking the termination and ordering that TPS protections remain in place while the case proceeds. For now, work permits remain valid. Deportations tied to the termination are on hold. The legal status quo remains intact. The Department of Justice is expected to appeal the ruling to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. However, given the strength of the court's factual findings, particularly regarding racial animus, overturning the injunction may prove difficult. This ruling sends a powerful message. It reinforces that the executive branch is bound by both statutory law and constitutional limits, even in the realm of immigration policy. It also serves as a warning that public rhetoric matters and that discriminatory intent can render an entire policy unlawful. For now, the termination is blocked, protections remain in place, and the federal courts have once again asserted their role as a check on executive power.